calculating the cost of absenteeism. It's a frightening statistic. Slightly more than half of incidental absenteeism is not due to illness. In this lesson we're going to talk about absenteeism and how to calculate the cost of absenteeism. And why do we talk about calculating the cost of absenteeism? Because if you understand how to calculate the cost of absenteeism, it is going to be much easier for you to calculate a return on investment on an intervention that reduces absenteeism. We're still thinking in terms of, hey, how do we calculate a return on investment? And we're going to start now at the cost side, specifically absenteeism. Whenever I talk about absenteeism, I always imagine a director sitting at a giant table in his boardroom, which is totally empty, saying, the topic of today's meeting is the high rate of absenteeism in this organization. What costs are involved in employee absenteeism? How do we quantify the cost of absenteeism? What I would like you to do is to take a few minutes, grab a piece of paper and a pen, and write down all the costs that you think are involved in absenteeism. In other words, if you had to quantify the cost of absenteeism, which factors would you include? Pause the video and take a few minutes to do this. When you think about the factors that make up absenteeism, you're thinking about lost wages, benefit payments, premium pay for temporary help or overtime, productivity loss, loss in morale, etc. Now, big question is, how can we quantify these costs? And we do this using activity-based costing. Now, cost of absenteeism can be split up in direct and indirect costs. And we'll start off with the direct cost. When we talk about the direct cost of absenteeism, the first one, the simplest one, is the hourly wages. When someone is sick for, say, 100 hours in a certain time period, then it's 100 times the hourly wage of that person, which is the direct cost of absenteeism. Now, the second element are employee benefits, which includes insurances, pension payments, holiday, etc. And benefits can be up to 40% in European countries, and in the US, benefits pay is usually a bit lower. So you have your hourly wages. For example, someone earns 10 euros an hour, and when someone then is sick for 100 hours, it's 1,000 euros. But when you talk about Euro countries, usually benefits are much higher. So the hourly costs are actually 13.50 or 14 euros an hour, because the benefits make up a big part of the pay for the employee. So figure out how this is for your organization and then calculate the benefits. Third is a premium pay for temporary help. Do you replace someone who's sick? If so, what do you pay that person? And do calculate those hours when you try to estimate the cost of absenteeism. You have premium pay for overtime work. Of course, not every employer pays for overtime, but if you do calculate them in the direct cost of absenteeism. You have organizational health services or HR administrative costs. The employee needs to call up HR and say, hey, I'm sick. Organizational health services can either assess someone, hire a doctor, etc. All costs related to absenteeism. And the final one is insurance premiums. When you have a higher level of absenteeism, insurance premiums usually go up. Not every organization uses insurance premiums, but it could be a key element of organizational cost. And you have, of course, other costs. When we talk about indirect costs, we have the cost to manage the effects of absence and replacement. And usually that's done by the direct manager. He needs to make sure when, for example, Bill falls ill, that Jill takes over. And that needs to be coordinated. Jill needs to be called, like, hey, can you come in today because Bill is sick? And the manager spends time on managing the effects of absenteeism. Now, the hours that the manager spends on this need to be quantified. You have replacement costs, especially when we talk about long-term turnover, recruitment, training of these new or temporary workers, an onboarding procedure, which also takes time and takes man-hours to help someone really get on board. You have productivity loss, both in terms of quality, like the quality of the service, the quality of the product goes down because you have someone taking over, someone who's not that familiar with the caseload, with the business, with the product. And you have productivity loss in quantity. Client service costs. You need to prepare for new clients that you are not too familiar with. The client gets a certain perception of the organization, like, hey, once again I get a new account manager. What's happening here? And employee morale, when someone is ill in the organization, it has an impact on the rest of the organization, especially when someone is ill for the long term. This can have a real impact. Now, number 4 and number 5 are hard to quantify. I realize that, but they do have an effect. So try to quantify them, or at least mention them for yourself when you do an ROI calculation. Now, big question is, how can we quantify these costs? And the easiest answer is just to add them. And there's 2 ways to do this. In the course material, I inserted an Excel file where all these costs are specified, and you can fill in how many hours people spend on, for example, managing the effects of absence, what the hourly rate of the in this case the manager is, how often this happens in the organization, and what this totals. So it's a really specific approach, really based on activity-based costing. Now, this is the very detailed way. If you need to make an analysis and you have all the time in the world, this is the way to go, this is the way to do it. To split out all the cost of absenteeism and then define it and get a full picture of all the costs. There's also an easier way. And this is the Haas Formula. It's written in 2003 by Haas. It basically takes the same elements, or at least the elements that are easiest to quantify that I just mentioned, and it puts them in a formula. And I'll read it out loud for you. You have the total cost of absenteeism per employee, which equals the hours lost due absence times weighted hourly pay plus the cost of employee benefits. And as I said, that could be up to 40% of the hourly wages, plus the hours that the supervisor lost in dealing with absenteeism. That's what we just mentioned as indirect cost. You multiply this number by the average hourly pay for the supervisor plus the cost of supervisor benefits per hour per supervisor. So the formula consists of the hours lost by the employee times the absolute total cost for the employer, which is wages plus benefits, plus the time lost by the supervisor times the absolute costs for the employer of that supervisor, which are hourly wages plus benefits. So those elements you add plus OC, which are other costs. And the other costs I'll define in the next slide. And then because we calculate the ACE, the total cost of absenteeism per employee, you divide it in the end by the number of employees. When we talk about other costs, in the other cost category, all the costs that we mentioned previously come back. You have temporary staff, overtime, cost of external agencies, cost of HR dealing with absenteeism, training, recruiting, onboarding, temporary staff, cost of insurance, loss in productivity, etc. The Haas formula is basically a seemingly easier way to calculate the cost of absenteeism, but you have an other cost category, which is again quite tricky to quantify, but it is absolutely possible. And the easiest way to do it is just to single out 2 or 3 cases, get an estimation of, hey, when someone is absent for 100 hours, we have these costs for external hires, we have these costs for overtime, and then generalize those costs to the rest of the organization. If you already have the data on these specific costs for your organization, then that's really good. Then you can work on that data. So to wrap up, there's 2 ways to calculate the cost of absenteeism. Do it by activity-based costing and splitting up the direct and the indirect cost, which is a solid way to do it. A slightly more approachable way to do it is to use the Haas formula, which is the total cost of absenteeism per employee. Take the number of hours that someone is absent times the cost of this employer for the employee, add the supervisory cost, and then add the other costs. And then once again, the other cost you need to split out and say, hey, if I quantify the cost of external agencies, you list the cost that they build to your organization. When you talk about the cost of HR dealing with absenteeism, they probably have a set number of hours that they spend on absenteeism. You can divide it by the number of individual cases, and you look at absenteeism frequency. So be innovative in how you calculate the different other costs in this formula. And the better you can do it, the better your picture is going to be of the absolute total cost of absenteeism. Anyway, to recap, why are we doing this exercise? To calculate the return on investment of an intervention, you need to know costs and expected benefits. Now, if you do an intervention, the costs of the intervention will be different from intervention to intervention. When you really want to calculate the benefits, you need to make an estimation and say, hey, absenteeism now is 4% and it will be reduced to 3.5%. That means that there's a reduction of 12.5%. So the cost saving of that reduction almost equals 12.5% of your total cost of absenteeism. And of course you need to calculate this out because you have a number of fixed and a number of variable costs, but it will start to approach this number. We did this exercise to calculate the cost of absenteeism just to get a good understanding of the potential benefits of whenever we do an intervention to reduce absenteeism. Because then calculating the benefit will be much easier. So in other words, whenever we make an intervention that has the purpose of reducing absenteeism, and we get an estimation of how much percent we can reduce absenteeism, we actually now have a solid picture of the potential monetary benefits, the amount of dollars or euros that is saved of this specific intervention. So the only thing we need to do, for example, when we start working with a training partner, is say, hey, what are the costs of your training? How much does it cost to work with you in terms of the cost that they will bill you and in terms of the number of hours that you need to spend on them, because that's of course also cost. And then you can say, hey, give me an estimation of the reduction of absenteeism in percentages. And if they can show you like, hey, this intervention reduces absenteeism from 4 to 3.5%, then you can say, hey, this amounts to a benefit of a certain number. And then using the simple ROI formula, say, hey, what are my net benefits divided by my total cost? And what is my payback period? That way you can actually calculate a return on investment.